evening, fellow citizens, and thank you for being out on this not so nice evening. Someone was telling me I must have done something really wrong upstairs because it's rained or snowed or something the last 3 times I've been here. Well, I'm sorry about that. We'll hopefully break the curse and very soon. But without further ado, I'd like to get into the topic for tonight, and I will be speaking in first person as Mr. Lincoln most of the time, just to give you a taste of it. This topic actually was brought to my attention by a loyal viewer, someone who came to one of my other presentations and suggested, why don't you do something on Lincoln as a railroad attorney? And I took that under advisement, and tonight's the result of that. So I do listen to my constituency, and a number of you have recommended some books already. You know, I'm filing this up here. That's why this hat is so big. There's not much in there, but some people argue that's true here as well. At any rate, we'll get started. We're going to have at it. Hopefully my technology will work. That's always the thing that I'm the most nervous about. Now, Mr. Lincoln loved technology. I love technology. But technology sometimes can be a fickle master, so we'll see how this works. Okay, Walt Whitman, of course, was one of my contemporaries. Actually, he knew me better than I knew him, but he would observe me rambling around Washington, walking sometimes, riding in my carriage, going back and forth between the Soldiers' Home and the Executive Mansion, which you folks know as the White House. But among all his other accomplishments, he wrote a poem dealing with the railroad. So that's what this is about, and that's the key. The lands to be welded together. I saw the potential of a transcontinental railroad long before there was such a thing. Long before anyone conceived of it, or certainly long before anyone built it, I could see the uniting potential of a transcontinental railroad. And of course, there was a lot of debate where this transcontinental railroad would actually be put. Ultimately, they chose the center of the continent, right across here, but there were different proposals. The South, of course, wanted it to be a southern railroad. That's why in 1853, the Gadsden Purchase was made, which is the area south of the Gila River. This area down in what's today New Mexico and Arizona, this was purchased separately from the Mexican Cession, which we acquired after the Mexican War. And it was purchased expressly to build what ultimately becomes the Southern Pacific Railroad. That's why Los Angeles is where it is. That was a railroad town that was established. Tucson, you know, these major cities that we hear about, they started out, many of them being railroad towns. So let's watch another excerpt. But I want you to keep that in mind throughout the presentation. The lands welded together. We had to reunite North and South, but we also had to unite East and West. And I was one of those someones that helped with that process. I certainly didn't do it alone. There were many people involved in this, but it was actually during my presidency that the route was finally established where the Transcontinental Railroad, the first one, would actually go. And so we're going to talk about that. But in order to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, you really have to understand me as a railroad attorney. And that's actually part of what this presentation is tonight as well. So now we're going to backtrack just a little bit. You know, this takes place post-Civil War. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished. The Golden Spike was driven on the 10th of May, 1869. But now we have to back up a few years and look at my career as a railroad attorney, why I was so interested in this, besides for what I've already stated, the fact that I understood the psychological power of welding the nation together with bands of steel. So let's look at my career as a trial attorney for a moment. 26 of America's 44 presidents have been lawyers. Of these, the one with the most significant private practice was myself, Abraham Lincoln, whose legal career began in 1836 and ended only after I was inaugurated in 1861. I was involved in over 5,500 cases at the trial level, and I had a large appellate practice in the Supreme Court of Illinois. I also appeared in 6 appeals in this would be the state Supreme Court, Illinois Supreme Court, arguing one personally. My trial work was quite varied. While most of my cases involved debt collection and other cases involving property rights, I also tried 194 criminal cases, 133 cases, 4 against railroads, and even some for divorce and patent matters. For a review of my trial work, here are 5 tips for today's trial lawyers from yours truly, Mr. Lincoln. Number 1, you need to prepare and be diligent. I once observed that the leading rule of the lawyer is diligence. The first obligation of the trial lawyer is to meticulously gather, sort, and understand the facts of the case. I captured the importance of preparation memorably by stating, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." Preparation is key. In my view, rhetoric will not save sloppy preparation. As I put it, if anyone upon his rare powers of speaking shall claim an exemption from the drudgery of the law, his case is a failure in advance. So just getting up there and talking like lawyers sometimes do, that's not enough. You've got to have something to back yourself up. The second point is use logic and detachment. A historian, Julie Festner, has described me as having a scientific mind. In my trial work, I favored the use of logic to advance the theme of my cases, rarely resorting to emotion or flowery rhetoric. I would often, in closing argument, carefully recite what I believed to be the opposition's best case, and then tear it down point by point. My law partner, William Herndon, who I affectionately called Billy, described my trial approach as being the patient but relentless unfolding of a case, reasoning through logic, analogy, and comparison. Point number 3, develop the key facts and let your theme emerge from them. I would select the facts I perceived as the critical facts and utilize only them in my presentation. With those facts as the base, I would let my theme emerge from them and tie my argument to them. I believed, as most top trial lawyers do, that less is more. And I think you can see some of this in my speeches. Why is the Gettysburg Address so short? Why is it so concise? Because I didn't want to use extra words that I didn't need. So it follows through into my presidency, into my speeches as well. Ignore small points. I would typically concede points made by my adversary when I saw them as unimportant to the overall context of my case theme. My focus was always on that point or points which my diligent preparation had identified as the heart of the case. So first you prepare, and then you ignore all this extra gobbledygook in between. You focus in laser sharp. So my focus was always on a particular point or points that my diligent preparation had identified as the heart of the case. Don't lengthen a trial by using a kitchen sink approach of dumping all the facts in front of the jury box, or another way of saying it is throw mud at the wall and see how much of it sticks. No, you have to be focused. This only bores the jurors, obscures what is necessary to win your case, and unduly lengthens the trial. Maybe the state legislature should, no, that's another matter. Use simple language. Adam Gottnick has amply described my style in the Gettysburg Address as a summation by simplicity. So that's what they call it. I employed the same approach in my trial work. I used simple language, particularly at the end of my closing argument, where single-syllable words predominated. As I told one of my partners, it is necessary to shoot down low and the common people will understand you. If you shoot too high, your bullets will go over the heads of the masses and only hit those who need no hitting. Okay, that's true in firing cannons also. Ken can relate to that. This also required a conversational style of talking with rather than to the jurors. So it's a conversation. I would take the jurors with me on a guided tour of the facts and logically set the base for them to draw the right conclusion. This, I rightly believed, would lead to a verdict for my client in most cases. So that's what all of that was on the screen, that no one can read because it's quite small. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about, in 1846, I was elected to the U.S. Congress, and I took a 2-year leave from my law practice. At the end of my appointment in Congress, I resumed my law practice with Billy Herndon, whom I mentioned. He worked hard to reestablish his position as an attorney, that's myself, and in 1849 I was allowed to practice before the Illinois Supreme Court. At the beginning of the 1850s, while still in partnership with Herndon, actually I would remain in partnership with him all the way through. I never relinquished my partnership. Even when I went to Washington, I instructed Billy keep the business running, and if I live, I will return and we'll pick up right where we left off. Of course, we know that didn't quite happen. But I started dealing with railroad cases in the beginning of the 1850s, and by the middle of the decade, I was considered one of the most successful Illinois practitioners of railroad law. My first significant case was in 1851, representing the Alton and Sangamon Railroad. There was a landowner by the name of James A. Barrett who refused to pay his pledge for his 30 shares of stock on the Alton and Sangamon. The company had changed the planned route, which affected the value of Barrett's land on which the railroad was to be built. The railroad retained my services and sued James Barrett. Now, the importance of this case was based on the fact that others might stop payments on their pledges, depriving the company of funds and the public of the advantage of new railroad routes. I built up my case proving that Barrett was a stockholder of the company and that the Alton and Sangamon had the right to sue for delinquent payment. I mean, he bought stock, so he's invested. The Illinois Supreme Court accepted my argument, which helped establish the principle that corporation charters could be amended in the face of public interest. This first case established me as one of the most prominent practitioners of railroad law in the state of Illinois. In cases involving railroads, I acted on behalf of whoever engaged my services. At times I represented the railroad, and at other times I represented their opponents. The period from 1849 to 1854 was very prosperous. This is when we expanded our house and so on. There's always been that joke about I came home one day and the house had been remodeled, and I asked the neighbor, where does Mr. Lincoln live? Because I don't recognize it. No, I was part of that, and actually some of that money was Mary's inheritance money, so she had a right to spend it as she saw fit. But nonetheless, we were able to do quite well for ourselves. So I managed to rebuild my career after a very lackluster term in Congress. Actually, I voted against the Mexican War, and people weren't happy about that. I voted for supplies for the troops, but I voted against the Mexican War because I saw it as a land grab for slavery. And slavery is really that cancer that's been eating at the country since its inception. And this is actually, it's the slavery issue that propels me back into national politics. I mean, I could have easily stayed in private practice. That would have been so easy. I was doing well. I had overcome a lot of obstacles to get to that point. Why in the world would you mess that up and go back into politics? Well, there's one reason. It's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Stephen Douglas, who you all know, I eventually defeated for the presidency in 1860, but not before he beat me in the senatorial campaign of 1858. But going back even a few years before that, in 1854, Senator Douglas of Illinois, now keep in mind, he's from the Chicago area. Chicago is fast becoming the new industrial hub of certainly of the Midwest, but I think you could even argue of the nation, because it has lake access to Lake Michigan, but from there, the plan was to build a network of railroads stretching to the west so that goods and services from the hinterlands could be brought to Chicago. Of course, all that would help foster Douglas's own political career. I mean, he's from Illinois, and he's from the Chicago area, so it's bringing stuff to his constituents. Well, he dreamed up, or he, pardon the pun, but he railroaded through Congress a bill that would have actually, the purpose of it was to settle Kansas and Nebraska. Now, keep in mind that this is one territory at the time. They hadn't been split into two states like they are today. But Kansas and Nebraska was a wide open area to the west, and it was prime ground. It was flat, it was fertile. Douglas wanted to get these territories populated with settlers as quickly as possible, because settlers mean, ultimately, votes. It's like, oh, we're beholden to you, Mr. Douglas, for giving us so many good things. We're going to vote you in. It's politics. I mean, still true today. At any rate, but what Douglas does is he tramps all over, actually he destroys the old Missouri Compromise, which put a boundary, which stopped slavery from expanding into those western territories. Because a line had been drawn back in 1820 saying that any territory north of 3630 latitude was not open to slavery. Slavery is prohibited. Well, if you look at the map, both Kansas and Nebraska are clearly north of Missouri's southern boundary. They should have been part of the prohibition on slavery. And now, with this popular sovereignty scheme that Douglas comes up with, oh, it sounds so democratic. Yeah, it was democratic, all right, with a capital D. Yes, I'm from the other party. At any rate, Douglas railroaded this through, totally destroyed the Missouri Compromise, and he created basically one hell of a storm. That's how he himself put it. And that's when I got back into national politics, because I wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. I never said that I was going to, and the South didn't hear me in 1860, or when I was running for president. They only heard Lincoln's an abolitionist, which I was never an abolitionist. I was anti-slavery. I wanted to stop the spread of it. Now keep in mind, I'm an attorney. We've established that. I respect private property. Slavery is legal in the South. You can't do anything about it. At least we thought we couldn't at the time. It took the Civil War to undo that. But I could try to get through a restoration of the Missouri Compromise line, which is what I was advocating in those early years. But that's what put me back into politics. Edmund Burke made a statement that evil thrives when good men do nothing, or put it another way, you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. I wanted to be part of the solution and put slavery on the road to ultimate extinction. So that's how I got back into national politics. But at the same time, an opportunity does come up related to the railroad industry, and this is sometimes referred to as my greatest case. So I want to take you through this. On May 6, 1856, the steamboat F.E. Afton crashed into the Rock Island Bridge, the first railroad bridge ever built across the Mississippi River. So it connects Rock Island, Illinois with Davenport, Iowa. No one was killed, but the boat was destroyed and the bridge was badly damaged. The financial loss for the boat's owners was substantial, and they sued not only to recover their losses, but to have the bridge torn down. So the steamboat industry, the steamboat lobby, and their lawyers were arguing that this bridge has to go. It's an obstruction to navigation on the Mississippi River. Well, think about that for a minute. What that would have meant if they would have prevailed. I don't want to be a spoiler, but they did. Yes, yes. One of the first to be built. Actually, the first one was built at St. Louis, but this was right after connecting Rock Island with Davenport. And what it turned out to be was actually the steamboat captain was drunk. That's why he ran into the pier in the first place. It had nothing to do with navigation, and had a lot to do with something else. But that would come out in the case. All right, the case had very broad implications. In the burgeoning battle of steamboats versus railroads, defeat would deal a blow not only to the losing company, but to the entire industry. And that's the key to this, why this is so important. The verdict would affect the economies of major American cities, from steamboat centers like St. Louis to others like Chicago that stood to grow in stature with the prominence of railroads. We already know that through Douglas's example. So bitter and all-consuming was the battle that representing the railroads would mark the first, though certainly not the last, time that I helped hold the Union together. As Brian McGinty argues in his book, which is featured there to the left, Lincoln's Greatest Case, it was the most important legal battle that I ever fought. I had a reputation even then as being scrupulously honest and extremely thorough, which we talked about. Later, while president, I would say that throughout my legal career, I habitually studied the opposite side of every disputed question, of every case, of every political issue more exhaustively, if possible, than my own side. You've all heard that expression, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Okay, that's paraphrasing what I just said. The result was that I'd never once been surprised in court by the strength of the adversary's case, often finding it much weaker than I had feared. The 1857 trial, Heard et al. Versus the Railroad Bridge Company, required the defense to convince the court that the bridge was not a material obstruction to the navigation of steamboats. As witnesses were questioned and cross-examined, one observer noted that I, Lincoln, who took part in more than 5,200 cases over the course of my career, had a supremely sharp grasp of the trial minutiae. Okay, and that's just a map showing the expansion of railroads up to Rock Island. Now they're actually expanding, going across the Mississippi, which was a major obstacle, but they overcame it. According to this particular observer, who someone observed me whittling as I listened to the witness testimony. I seem to have committed all the facts and figures to memory and often corrected evidence so effectively as to cause a ripple of mirth. So here I am whittling the stick, but I object, you know, that kind of thing. I was listening at the same time. It's called multitasking. Lincoln's law partner later spoke of the effect that the gangly future president had on juries. He noted that Lincoln's speaking voice was shrill, squeaking, piping, you can decide that for yourself. But that is, as he went on, became harmonious, melodious, and musical. If you please, with face somewhat aglow, his form dilated, swelled out, and he rose up to a splendid form, erect, straight, and dignified. I'll try to stand straight. The defense, in trying to prove the bridge's value, attempted to make the case that not only wasn't it an obstruction, but that given the number of trains that had already passed over it, carrying passengers and goods, it had a value to society that should, they believed, override any considerations of damage to steamboats and made the case for the two technologies to coexist. So there hadn't been a problem up till now, but all of a sudden we're supposed to tear this bridge down. I made a key argument on this point, providing the court with the history of a similar bridge and its impact on the surrounding community, and declaring that the necessity of the bridge could not be ignored. I began my closing argument by telling the jury in a characteristically Lincolnian way that I did not propose to assault anybody or assail anybody, but that I expected to grow earnest as I proceeded, but not ill-natured. This was just a ploy on my part, I'll admit that, to get the jury to like me. In a hard-hitting speech then, I, who called the opponent's version of events an absurdity and an impossibility, convinced the jury that I was not anti-steamboat, but that the case was being supported by the powerful steamboat lobby, and that according to McGinty, he and his colleagues were only standing up to a powerful interest opposed to any and all bridges over the Mississippi. I also told jurors that there's a travel from east to west whose demands are growing larger and larger, building up new counties with a rapidity never before seen in the history of the world. The case ended with a 9-3 jury vote in favor of the bridge owners. Since the vote wasn't unanimous, the trial ended in a hung jury. As this denied the steamboat owners their relief, it was effectively a victory for the bridge owners, although technically it was a hung jury. Several years of appeals followed, and the case made its way to the Supreme Court. That's the U.S. Supreme Court now. Ultimately, the bridge owners' victory was affirmed, and railroads overtook steamboats as the nation's primary method of transportation. I, who within 4 years would be president, received $400 for my work on the case. At the same time, now we're moving into 1860. The eventual route of the Transcontinental Railroad followed the Platte River Valley, but even before that, we had a development known as the Pony Express. That was created in 1860. They used the old Mormon and Oregon trails area. Not surprisingly, but that was this was kind of a link in the technological chain. So it went from just wagons to the Pony Express, now delivering the mail. Ultimately, the railroad would supersede that. Okay, how did I get into the railroad business as far as the Transcontinental Railroad? Well, in 1859, I actually went to Council Bluffs, Iowa, to do some business. That was another matter that I had to settle there. But while I was there, I looked up a gentleman that I'd heard about who was supposed to be an expert, and he was, on railroad engineering. His name was Grenville Dodge. This is how we get Fort Dodge, Iowa, how we get Dodge County, Minnesota, how we get Dodge Center. They're all named after this gentleman. And Grenville Dodge becomes the chief engineer ultimately for the Union Pacific Railroad when that was created. But this is Dodge's story. Actually, I went to meet him. So even before I become a serious contender for the Republican presidential nomination, the year earlier, I went with the purpose of locating a route for a transcontinental railroad. I mean, I was interested in that. A lot of people were interested in that. It was just a matter of where to put it. But I met Grenville Dodge, a Council Bluffs resident, and after meeting with him, as depicted in this painting, I was particularly impressed with Dodge's suggestion to build the Union Pacific Railroad across the Platte River Valley. It's stuck in my head, people. This was the seed that would later grow into the legislation that I'm about to tell you about, which, of course, is what created it. So that conference took place in Council Bluffs. Actually, this location marks the spot. It overlooks the Missouri River. Behind it here is the current, today's city of Omaha, Nebraska. And we'll get to why the railroad actually started in Omaha rather than Council Bluffs in a moment. But for now, it was supposed to, the eastern terminus was supposed to be Council Bluffs. Okay, Mr. Dodge's recollections, or he ultimately becomes General Dodge. His recollections were, I remember that in 1859, when I returned from a trip on the plains, see, he'd been out there. That's how he was so knowledgeable about this area. He'd been out there as a scout for the Army. He knew what was out there, and he could recommend to me, just this, I suppose he saw me as an Eastern politician. I really wasn't. I was a Midwesterner like himself. But nonetheless, he saw this as an opportunity to share his views, and I was very interested in hearing those. So Dodge recalls that in 1859, when he returned from a trip to the plains, he met me at the Pacific House. I came up from St. Joseph on a steamer to look after an interest that I'd bought in the Riddle Tract from N.B. Judd of Chicago. Mr. Lincoln sought me out, this is Dodge Recollections now, and was greatly interested in the project of a Pacific Railroad. And I gave him all the information I had, going fully and thoroughly into it. I was very decided that the Great Platte route was, from our early explorations and surveys, the best, most feasible, and far superior to any of the others explored by the government. Why? Because it's relatively flat. The Platte River, how many of you have been across Nebraska? I mean, it's got a few hills, and you get the sand hills and so on out to the west. But in the Platte River Valley, it's pretty flat. Well, when you're building a railroad, you want it to be as smooth and as flat a surface as possible, because that will save money both in construction and ultimately when the trains are running. The steeper the grade, the more coal it's going to burn, the more wood it's going to burn to make the train go. So you want to make your road as level as possible. That's still true with highways. Is it not?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So highways have kind of taken over from railroads, but the idea is, the knowledge gained in one transfers to the other. Okay.
Lincoln
Yes, sir.
Didn't you buy some land in Council Bluffs?
I did. And I could actually show you those remind me at the end. I've got a map of where they are in Iowa. I don't have it in this presentation, but yes. Crawford County was one place. There were actually 2 tracts of land. I didn't actually buy the land. It was offered to me as a reward for my participation in the Black Hawk War. It was a military bounty that was given. And I was very proud of that. I never claimed the land in Iowa, but I kept those documents and showed them to my sons that, you know, this is something you can do as an American. If you serve your country, it will serve you, was the lesson that I was trying to instill into them. But back to Dodge's Recollections. In 1861, General S.R. Curtis of Iowa reported for the Pacific Railroad Committee of Congress the first Pacific Railroad Act, and Senator Harlan of Iowa, by the way, Senator Harlan's daughter would later marry Robert Lincoln, my eldest son, finally succeeded in making it a law. In March of 1862, the Union Pacific Railroad Company was organized. This is actually the document that created what you folks know as the Pacific Railway or the first transcontinental railroad. And if you can see from where you're sitting, perhaps not, but down here is actually my signature, and it's signed Abraham Lincoln. I only sign my name on very, very, very important papers. Most of the time it was just A. Lincoln, like some memo that I dashed off to some general or whatever in the field. But something of this significance, I signed it Abraham Lincoln. So you know by looking at that was pretty important. And that's a facsimile of the actual bill. Or I should say it's actually a photograph of the actual bill. That is the actual bill. Okay, it was a monumental act. As early as 1830s, the United States began exploring the idea of building a railroad to connect the country and to extend its reach. Of the many competing ideas for the Transcontinental Railroad, a clear path was created in the early 1860s. You could add Grenville Dodge to the list, but it's Grenville Dodge, Theodore Judah, sometimes called Crazy Judah, because all he wanted to talk about was the railroad, and myself. The U.S. House of Representatives voted for the line on May 6, 1862, and the Senate on June 20th. I signed it into law on July 1st. 2 companies were hired. The Central Pacific would build from the west and the Union Pacific from the east. Besides land grants along the right-of-way, each railroad was paid $16,000 per mile. I'm sorry, yeah, 16. Make sure I get my numbers right here. $16 a mile, I'm sorry. That was built over an easy grade. 32 per mile in the high plains and 48,000 per mile in the mountains. These terms encouraged the companies to construct many extra miles of track, direct the line toward property they owned, and in many other ways exploit the poorly written law to their benefit. So there was a lot of corruption, there was a lot of graft that came along later. We could talk about that in depth. There was a lot of problems with the railroad, but you can't take away from the fact that it was a marvel for its time. Now Dodge is a little more humble about it. He says the law of 1862 did not bring the results we hoped for. No money could be raised under its provisions, and the only result was a series of explorations made in 1863 and the breaking of ground at Omaha. Notice it's Omaha now instead of Council Bluffs. In 1863, I think about June, while in command at Corinth, I received an order to report to Washington, and I was informed that the president wished to see me, and that's true, I sent for him. I had no idea what the president could wish to see me about. In fact, I was a good deal puzzled at that order. When I reached Washington and called on the president, I found that he desired to consult me upon the proper place for the initial point of the Union Pacific, and that he had not forgotten, and that's the key point, he had not forgotten our previous conversation in 1859. Now, why Omaha instead of Council Bluffs? Omaha's city boosters, with the help of the Union Pacific Railroad, succeeded in wresting the eastern terminus away from Council Bluffs in favor of their city. By building west from Omaha, the Union Pacific would not be responsible to have to build a bridge across the Missouri River, as it would have if Council Bluffs had remained the eastern terminus. Somebody else would have to figure out how to build that bridge, and they ultimately did, but it wasn't going to be the UP. So in other words, the UP was trying to save itself some money, so they just started across the river. Pretty smart on their part. I don't think Council Bluffs was real happy about that. The Union Pacific Missouri River Bridge at Omaha is one of the most strategically important railroad bridges in the United States. The river crossing here goes back to 1872. Union Pacific and Central Pacific completed the rail line in 1869 to the west coast. However, they had no way to connect this line to the Eastern Railroad network. A connection was completed through Kansas City in 1870, which left Omaha being the poor sister to Kansas City, which grew into the major railroad hub west of Chicago. Omaha desperately wanted to stay in the game by attempting to lay track over the ice on the frozen Missouri River. Not the best idea. That ended up being futile due to the shifting ice. The first bridge connecting Council Bluffs and Omaha was built in 1872 and opened on March 25th the following year. This bridge was built using tubular iron pegs and so on. It was later replaced by the 1888 bridge, and then again after, or during World War I, it was replaced again using the piers from the 1888 bridge to do it. So the structure that you see today was actually built in 1916, but it's in that same location. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Union Pacific first. It was largely built by Irish immigrants who were suffering the effects of the potato famine that started in the 1840s. We're now up to the 1860s, and they're still suffering, but thousands of Irish immigrants were coming over. Not only Irish immigrants, but after the Civil War, we had soldiers from both sides that were working on the railroad. You had African Americans, and of course, in the Central Pacific, you had the Chinese, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this is an example of a Union Pacific Railroad camp during construction of the line. Notice this. It looks like a bunch of boxcars here with some buildings. They literally brought in towns on wheels and set them up. Those were the work camps. And then when they got done laying the track, they just slid this thing down the line. It's like stage sets. But this was the beginning of the towns that would be built along this route. Okay, just some more of these commemorative items I said I would show you, again, from the 75th anniversary. But this is actually the stamp that just came out for the 150th anniversary, actually last week. So, yeah, thank you for sharing those. Yeah, he brought those in so you can actually see it close up and personal. But you can go down to your post office and buy those. And of course, they had a major commemoration for the 150th anniversary, which was very well attended. The sad part of that Golden Spike ceremony the first time around was that none of the workers really got to participate. It was all the big shots, you know, Leland Stanford and Durant and some of these other guys, you know, the leaders. But if you look at that photograph, very few of the workers, and particularly the Chinese, were excluded, even though they did a lot to build the thing.
But the other day now, they brought the Chinese.
Yes. Yes. Oh yeah.
And apologize. So
Yep. And that's why. Going back to Grenville Dodge, we need to get back to the Civil War now. We've talked a lot about the railroad, but that's because this is the 150th year. But just to say a couple more things about Grenville Dodge. The same year that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, he built his handsome Victorian home at 605 3rd Street. This is in Council Bluffs. You can actually go see it. That wasn't the home he was living in when he met with me 10 years earlier. It wasn't there yet, but of course he made some money off of the railroad as well, being a railroad engineer. And there was a lot of corruption. I mean, the Gilded Age, the 1870s, the decade after the Civil War, which saw an enormous amount of railroad building all over the West, including right here in Minnesota. But there was an enormous amount of corruption because the government was so eager to help assist that they were basically giving money away, and people were taking advantage of that. So unfortunately, there was a lot of corruption. Even the Vice President of the United States got involved in that. His name was Schuyler Colfax. He was Speaker of the House when I was president. He died in Mankato, actually, in 1885. Coincidentally, or not, he was actually traveling by railroad. Schuyler Colfax, the Vice President, he died in Mankato at changing trains, actually. Weather was bad then, too. Maybe it is a curse. Yeah, it was below zero. It was about it was a January day. You can imagine, cold, and he had a heart attack and died. He was traveling. He just happened to be passing because the tracks went through Mankato. He was on his way out to the west. One of his numerous trips that he made. In fact, Schuyler Colfax was, if not the last person, certainly one of the last people to talk to me before I went to the theater on April 14th, 1865. Now, stepping out of character for a moment, I, Bryce Stenzel, was actually born across the street from where Schuyler Colfax died. So put that together, the last person to talk to Abraham Lincoln died across the street from where I was born. So maybe there's something to that coincidence thing. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. So let's step back into character so I can finish up the lecture. We need to talk a little bit about railroads during the Civil War, because they would play a pivotal role in deciding how the campaigns transpired. The North not only held a commanding advantage in total mileage, but also boasted a mighty industrial machine across New England. There were many reasons for the South's failure to achieve victory. One of the most noteworthy was inability to properly utilize the railroad. Now it's interesting because the South actually, at the beginning, if you recall the first Battle of Bull Run, how did Stonewall Jackson's troops get to the battlefield? And they were fresh, and they reinforced, the Confederates that were already there, and that's why they won the day. Now you would have thought they would have learned from that, and we got to beef up our railroads, but they never quite caught on to their demise. I'm glad they didn't catch on, but that's from my perspective. So one of the most noteworthy was its inability, this is the South now, to properly utilize the railroad. It also faced an unseen problem of suffering tremendous damage from Union forces, which was successful in regularly disrupting the operations. Since most of the fighting occurred below the Mason-Dixon line, this issue was only magnified as the conflict wore on. Now, for its part, the North also suffered setbacks. Most noteworthy was the venerable Baltimore and Ohio, which lay at the heart of the fighting. Initially, the B&O was an ardent Southern sympathizer, but that changed after a series of Confederate attacks severely crippled its network. As Mike Schrader notes in his book, Classic American Railroads, it proved an invaluable asset to the Union. Aside from the war, railroads dealt with other issues throughout the 1860s, such as numerous track gauges, and that was a problem in the South too. The distance between the track is called gauge. And the South had all these different gauges, and so their railroad cars weren't interchangeable. They could only run on certain tracks, and they couldn't, they couldn't utilize the network type principle where the North figured out a standard gauge. Ken, do you happen to know what that was offhand? What's the standard railroad gauge? 4.5 or 5.5 feet across. Okay. Yep. I knew he would know, so that's why I called on him. But at any rate, I'm just going to walk you through these quickly. But there you can see some of the damage that was done during the war. This became almost a sport to tear up the opposing sides of railroads. And of course, the South, as the war went on, had less and less raw materials to rebuild with, were the North, they could just go to the factory down the street, or maybe that's a little too simplistic, but they had ways of repairing their infrastructure much faster, much more efficiently. So it's interesting. Southern leaders believed civilian rail movements should take precedent over military transport. Hello? It was not until the war's final years did the Confederacy understand the railroad's usefulness. In contrast, by 1862, the North began laying the groundwork for what became a united and efficient transportation network, and you already know that it begins with my signing of the Pacific Railway Act into law on July 1st, 1862, culminating with what we just saw, the Transcontinental Railroad. But I do want to also point out that on July 2nd, and jump to the bottom of the slide there, on July 2nd, 1864, I signed an updated Pacific Railroad Act into law, which created the Northern Pacific. So not only did I create, or help create, the Transcontinental Railroad, the first one, I also was part of the effort to create the Northern Pacific. And then, as previously mentioned, the significant damages Southern railroads received, the Baltimore and Ohio was also hit hard since its main line was situated right along Union and Confederate lines. But there you can see in that picture how they're transporting military, in this case a mortar, using railroad technology. And of course, I've already mentioned Stonewall Jackson. The picture on the left there, that's a Sherman necktie party. That's what it's called. When Sherman's troops invaded Georgia, what was the first thing they did? They tore up the railroads, and then they took the rails and actually heated them up and then wrapped them around trees or whatever was standing that they could find, rendering them useless. Because they would have to be melted down and recast in order to make a new rail, and the South just didn't have the ability to do that. They had limited smelting capabilities as it was, and certainly out in the middle of nowhere where this was happening, you couldn't just set up a forge and come out with new rails. So once they were rendered useless, that was it. The railroad in Lee's last final campaign, Lee was actually trying to use this Danville railroad actually running down here west of Petersburg. After Petersburg fell in early 1865, Lee was trying to escape to the west and then to the south into North Carolina. And if he could have done that using the Danville Railroad, perhaps the Confederacy could have set up shop somewhere else. But of course, Lee was pursued by Grant and Sheridan, and even Custer got in the act there and surrounded him. And eventually, Lee was forced to surrender at Appomattox. Okay, just one more brief note here. Talking about my inaugural, we were talking at the beginning about my inaugural trip from Springfield to Washington City. And as early as 1861, there were numerous assassination plots. The fact that I was assassinated, that's not shocking. What's shocking is that I wasn't assassinated sooner than I was. And as early as 1861, there was a major plot afoot. Alan Pinkerton, who had founded his own detective agency, and by the way, that's where we get the term private eye from, because his motto was, the eye is always watching. Talk about creepy. But nonetheless, Pinkerton had alerted me to the fact that this plot was going on, and he even devised a system for me to get through Baltimore. Now, Baltimore was one of those cities where you had to change trains, and this is because of the gauge issue. The standard gauge hadn't been established, and Baltimore being a southern city, they wouldn't have used it anyway. And so the train actually passed through Camden Yards, which is where the Baltimore Orioles play now. Apparently it was a bad neighborhood then, and it probably still is, unless you're an Orioles fan. At any rate, what was supposed to happen was this gang of, they called themselves plug uglies, they're just basically thugs, were going to intercept the train because it had a stop, and then I had to get out and actually get on another train on a different line to continue on to Washington. And so somewhere in that process of getting off the one train and getting on the other, I would be intercepted by the plug uglies and they would do their foul deed. Yes, sir?
I believe you had a walk, wasn't it about 2 to 3 blocks?
Yes, yes, yeah. And I was doing this at about 3 in the morning. Yeah, Pinkerton came up with this idea for a disguise. This is what I was wearing. Of course, this is a newspaper depiction of it. But I was supposed to look like a Scotsman with the cap and the long tails. Now, the press had a heyday with this. When I got to Washington safely and the press found out how it was done, of course, they made a big deal out of it. You know, I was a coward, that I snuck into Washington. I swore that I would never put myself in that position again, and of course I didn't, but it didn't have any better results at the end. But yeah, that's the whole disguise thing. And then finally, my body, of course, after I was assassinated, it's kind of appropriate for someone who championed the railroad to actually be brought back aboard a funeral car. I'm just going to walk you through this very quickly because we're running out of time. But that was actually the funeral route going back to Springfield, 1,700 miles. There was a special train car built for this. This would be like Air Force One of today, except it wasn't a plane, it was a railroad car. I never rode in this in life. I was supposed to. That was supposed to be the presidential railroad car. Well, I got to ride in it once, but not in life. That's Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's the station there. We've come full circle because now the original furniture that was on that funeral car is now owned by the Union Pacific Railroad Museum. If you go to Council Bluffs, Iowa, you can actually see the genuine artifacts that were on the funeral train, and there they are, some of the chairs and so forth. What happened to the funeral car? It ended up in Columbia Heights, Minnesota. A man by the name of Thomas Lowry. You've all heard of the Lowry Tunnel and other things named after him. Okay, he was a great promoter. And what he wanted to do was actually create it would be the equivalent to Disney World. You know, it wasn't called that. That was probably going to be called Lowry World. Who knows? But anyway, he was a very avid promoter. And so he bought this car because it had been in storage and so on. And it was ever used once. But he bought it and was going to have it restored. Of course, by now it's in pretty bad shape. By the time he buys it in the early part of the 20th century, 1911 actually is when this happened. So from 1865 to 1911, it just pretty much sat and depreciated. It's in pretty bad shape, but he's going to restore it and use it for a tourist attraction. You'll come and see Lincoln's funeral car. Well, there was a prairie fire, at least that's what the newspapers called it. I have to wonder if maybe there was some arson involved. According to the newspapers, lightning set the grass on fire around this structure. I happen to think it was something else, foul play. But for whatever reason, the car burned. And all that's left of it are a few metal pieces, which if you go to the Anoka County Historical Society, they will show you. So that's where it ended up. Any questions or comments? Otherwise, I want to thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience, and I bid you an affectionate farewell.
I was going to say, railroad set time zone. What year, rule on that?
I'm sorry.
Railroad set time zones?
Yeah, that actually was started, and they chose Greenwich, England, because the British ruled the world pretty much at the time, and so that becomes the focal point for the zero meridian. But yes, time zones were created exactly so that trains could run on time. Because of course, if you use sun time, it's going to be different as the sun, traverses.
What year was that?
I'd have to look that up. Anyone recall when time zones were invented?
Probably 10 years at least after 60.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it took a while. That's a very good question. One of those I have to look up. But that was the reason for it, was to standardize so that they could come up with those railroad timetables, and you would know exactly how fast or how soon the train would be arriving at a different place, because obviously sun times would be different in St. Louis than it was in Philadelphia. So they had to have a system of standardized time, and they chose Greenwich, England, because, as I said, the British, the sun never set on their empire at that point. The British had holdings all over the world. I mean, if it had been done under Napoleon, then it probably zero would have been in Paris. If it had been done under Stalin, it would have been in Moscow. You know, it just depends. Meridians, it doesn't make any difference. There's only one place on the Earth's surface that latitude divides exactly between the two hemispheres, and that's the equator. But when you're going the other way, when you're going with longitude, it doesn't make any difference. You can put that 0 point anywhere. Of course, opposite of 0 is 180, because there's 180 degrees in half a circle. That's why the international date line is 180 degrees on the other side. And it just kind of worked out for them that it ran down through the Pacific, where there weren't a lot of inhabitants. You know, there's a few islands. In fact, there's one island where the date line runs right through the island. So it's Sunday on one side of the island and it's Monday on the other. But that's right. That's right. Yeah, and that gets messed up. Anyone that's done airline travel knows about the jet lag. That when you're dealing with time zones, it gets really weird. Just one follow-up to that, and then I promise I will let you go. This is Assassination connection, but you mentioned Robert and being the president after George Pullman died. Well, it's from George Pullman's death, his business partner, that Robert conceived of the idea to finally get me, he thought, interred once and for all, so they'd stop moving me around, because my body was actually moved 17 times from the time it was first laid to rest in 1865 until 1901, 36 years later, when they finally did what Robert proposed. And he got this idea from George Pullman, because George Pullman was not popular with his employees. There was numerous strikes. You've all heard of the Pullman strike. I believe that was, what, 1906?
And that whole African-American history of the porters for the Pullman Company is absolutely fascinating, too.
But at any rate, when Pullman died, they buried him. They have a obelisk or a pillar above him, but underneath they put him in a concrete vault. You know, when we build bridges, you know, with the rebar, and then you pour the concrete on top of that, and then it hardens up and it's solid. Well, they did that with George Pullman. Robert got the idea from this. They had put his casket down into a steel rebar box, and then filled that up with concrete, and made a cube, so that they could never disturb. You know, the workers couldn't come in and dig him up and parade him through the streets like Ayatollah Khomeini or whatever. Well, Robert got the same idea, because the tomb, this monument to me, they built it on very faulty foundations. There were springs and other things underneath the tomb, and it kept settling unevenly. And finally, in 1901, they totally re-gutted it. It was about the third time they did this, but they totally rebuilt it. And Robert says, I want to do the same thing. So they put me in one of those rebar cubes, filled it up with concrete, and buried me 10 feet below the floor. They thought that would stop me, but here I am. So anyway, on that note, good night and have a safe evening. And come back next year.